Okay. So the Torah portion this week is a double portion, Acharei and Kedoshim. And I'll just go over what the concepts are in the Parsha, even though the class is really going to focus on the first two verses and on the Rashi commentary on those verses. But nevertheless, I'll just go over what the Parsha is about. The Parsha begins that after the death of the two sons of Aaron, which we read a few weeks ago, that they were passed away when a fire came out from the Holy of Holies and burned them after they went inside to offer incense, which they had not been asked to do. So after that, Hashem said to Moshe to tell Aaron not to come into the Holy of Holies at all times. He can only come in at certain times, which is Yom Kippur, and even then only after bringing certain sacrifices. And the Torah goes into great length about those sacrifices and how they're brought and how they're designated and how the blood is sprinkled and so on. And incense that's brought into the Holy of Holies, the special clothes that Aaron has to wear. He has to go to the mikveh many times. A lot of details about that. Then we have some laws of other sacrifices. And then we have some laws about forbidden relationships. And then we have the Torah portion of Kedoshim, which has very many mitzvahs in it. Just a lot of mitzvahs, an assortment of mitzvahs, if you will. Talks about, for example, keeping Shabbos and what tithes have to be given to the poor, and how to treat other people, not to cause the blind to stumble, meaning to say not to give bad advice, not to hate each other, not to take revenge, to love each other. On the contrary, the fruit of the first 3 years are forbidden, not to cut the payas, not to shave the beard, not to tattoo, to respect the elders, and to have honest weights and measures. And then once again, towards the end of the parsha, about forbidden relationships. So,
Told them not to.
No, there's a lot of positive mitzvahs also in Kedoshim about how to treat other people properly, loving your fellow Jew, respecting elders, respecting teachers. So there's both. Susan, you have a question?
Yeah, yes, sir. It seems like is this in the very beginning? Is Aaron paying for the bad deeds of his two sons?
No, on the contrary, he's getting a raise.
But they did something. They weren't supposed to bring. They were not supposed to go into the. I guess where the ark, wherever the.
Well, they died. That's bad enough punishment to have his son
But
die.
But then Aaron has to wear special clothing, and he's not allowed to go into the holy place.
That's not a punishment. That's not a punishment.
Oh, it's not?
No. Those are the rules to enter the Holy of Holies.
Oh.
The two sons passed away because they did not behave with the proper respect, and they entered the Holy of Holies without the right preparations.
Oh.
And these are the right preparations.
Okay, now I understand.
Okay, so let's just go back to the first two verses. I did not make a handout, not because I didn't mean to, but because, like I said, I was completely discombobulated and I forgot. So I'll just read the verses, and here they go. Hashem spoke to Moshe after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they came close to Hashem and they passed away.
No, Rabbi Citron.
It is Rabbi Citron, yes.
Yes, he's on. Yes, you're joining you.
Okay.
My son is showing me.
No worries. Okay. So the words in Hebrew for after the death is Acharei Mos, and that's where we get the name of the parsha. And then the next pasuk says, Hashem says to Moshe to speak to Aaron, your brother. He should not enter into the holy place at any time, so that he should not die, because he can only be seen, Hashem will only appear, so to speak, with the cloud of the incense. Okay, so what exactly is the connection between the instructions that Hashem is giving here to Moshe to give to Aaron as far as when and how to enter the Holy of Holies, with the fact that the two sons of Aaron passed away? It could have said the same thing without giving that introduction. Hashem spoke to Moshe, speak to Aaron, he should not come at all times into the Holy of Holies. Just cut out the first verse of the portion, and it would have been fine. And Rashi says, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah gave a parable to explain this verse and why it's necessary. He said it can be compared to a sick person, that a doctor came to pay him a visit. And he said to him, listen here, you cannot eat cold foods, and you cannot sleep in a damp place. Obviously, this fellow was not allowed to catch a cold because of whatever other ailments he had. And the doctor was warning him against that. So he's telling him basically he has to eat warm foods and not sleep in a damp place. Okay, fair enough. Comes along another doctor and he says, make sure not to eat cold foods or sleep in a damp place, so that you should not die like so-and-so died. That's what the second doctor said. Obviously, the second doctor did a better job than the first doctor, because, it's one thing, the doctor says, you got to exercise, you got to eat healthy, don't smoke, don't drink, don't have too much salt, don't eat too much fat, processed foods, I don't know, whatever doctors say, all kinds of things. And sometimes it's like, yeah, I heard that all before, but I'll be fine. And then the doctor says, well, look at this. If you don't do this, look at what can happen. I just went to my 30-year yeshiva graduation anniversary in New York, which is why I was a little bit out of sorts in my schedule. And one of my classmates was saying how he got colon cancer at the age of 42. And thank God they caught it when it was only like stage 2.5. And they were able to take it out with an operation and treatments and whatever. And now he's considered to be cancer-free. And basically the class really made a pretty strong resolution that everybody has to have a colonoscopy. So it's one thing if we would have just, announced that the doctor advises, which the doctors do advise to have one at age 50 or maybe even 45, they're saying now. But
Every 10
we
years.
had a classmate who could have died if not for the fact that he happened to have one. I don't know why he did. So it's much more, it hits you much harder when you see that reality. So this is how Rashi explains why Hashem told Moshe specifically to tell Aaron to follow these rules about how and when to enter into the Holy of Holies, V'lo yamus, so that he should not die. And when it says that he spoke to him after the death of the two sons of Aaron, it's not just informing us that we should know when Hashem spoke to Moshe, but this is part of what Moshe was supposed to tell Aaron. Follow this recipe, and you should not die as your sons did, because the sons of Aaron entered the Holy of Holies, and it was not Yom Kippur. Does anybody know offhand what day of the year they entered the Holy of Holies?
I think it was the day of the dedication of the Mishkan.
Exactly. What day was that?
Rosh Chodesh Nisan.
Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Thank you very much. Exactly. So, so that's when that took place. Was not Yom Kippur, nor did they bring any special sacrifices. Now they did bring ketores, but they didn't follow the prescribed procedure to enter into the Holy of Holies, as is described here. Now, of course, at that time, there was no procedure that was prescribed yet, so they shouldn't have gone in at all without some kind of permission. It's just not appropriate to go into such a holy place without permission. Depending on the level of the holiness of the place, there are more laws about being able to enter it. So, for example, in the Temple Mount, I'm just going off the topic a little bit. In the Temple Mount, there are certain restrictions about who's allowed to come in and who's not allowed to come in. You have to have a certain level of purity in order to enter into the Temple Mount. And then to enter into the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, even though there is no Beis HaMikdash, but the area that was in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, there has to be a higher level of purity. And then to enter into the section of the Kohanim, you have to be a Kohen, plus an even higher level of purity. And then to enter into the Holy of Holies, even a Kohen cannot do. Only a Kohen Gadol wearing the special clothes on Yom Kippur. You know, nowadays they have people who want to go up to the Temple Mount and do whatever they do over there. And that's not really advisable from a halachic perspective. Because to go onto the Temple Mount, you have to have a certain level of ritual purity, tahara. Specifically, even if a person did come into contact with the dead, they cannot be impure with any impurity that came out of their body. So in terms of a man, that means any ejaculation. In terms of a woman, in terms of getting her period. So a person would have to go to the mikveh after, those events, and only then would they be able to go onto the Temple Mount. Now, I'm sure some of the people who go onto the Temple Mount follow those rules, but I highly doubt all of the people do. Besides the fact that, are they careful not to go into the area that was once the Azorah, the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, where a person who ever walked into a cemetery or ever was in the same room as a dead body, you're not allowed to go there. So that's basically almost everybody alive today. So these are very strict laws, and is it worth going to the Temple Mount for whatever reason people want to go there, to show that it's ours and sovereignty, blah, 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 blah. Those are nice ideas, but is it worth doing that at the risk of doing a very severe sin? I'm going off the topic a little bit, but I'll mention my friend's ex-wife, who said she was in Israel for Sukkot, and her friend said to her, we're going up to the Temple Mount today, and why don't you come with us? And she said, well, since I got divorced, I haven't gone to the mikvah. So her friend said to her, well, you can go to the mikvah today. So she said, yeah, but I haven't counted 7 clean days. So her friend said, yeah, nobody will know. So she said, what do you mean nobody will know? Do you believe in this stuff or not? If you believe in it, then who cares about anybody else if it's the wrong thing? And if you don't believe in it, then why are you even going up to the Temple Mount? Anyway, whatever, that was just a rant. Sorry about that. So, back to the Parsha. So Hashem was basically telling Moshe to encourage Aaron not to break any of these laws, because otherwise, God forbid, he could end up like his kids ended up. And that is to be compared to the doctor who gives advice together with an example to encourage the person to follow his advice. So far, so good?
Yes.
Yes,
Very
perfect.
good. Very good. Okay, so the question that the Lubavitch Rebbe asks on this Rashi is that, I mean, this is a very obvious idea, that if you want to really teach a lesson, you'll give an example of that lesson. It seems to be self-understood, and it doesn't seem to be necessary for Rashi to give an example for us to understand why Hashem would point to the sons of Aaron. Obviously, if you want somebody to listen to you, then you give them an example so they'll see that what you're saying is true and is real, and it's not just a fantasy, and so on. On the other hand, we can ask another question from the other angle. Does Aaron really need that kind of encouragement? After all, Aaron was a great tzaddik, somebody who you would think is ready to do exactly what Hashem wants him to do, is not going to question. And if Hashem says this is how you go in, and this is when you go in, why would he think to do anything else other than what Hashem said, to the extent that we have to point to his sons and say, this is what happened, watch out, whatever. What would be tempting to Aaron, so much so that we have to give this drastic example from his sons? Anybody? Ideas?
I think maybe the point is you can't live on someone else's, the way someone else responds. In other words, maybe his sons thought, oh, well, my dad is such a famous tzaddik and we can live on his laurels. That's not the way it is. You can't, just because it's his sons doesn't mean they have to follow the rules just the way everyone else does.
That happens to be true. That is a good point. That you can't expect to get a pass just because you come from holy stock. And the same can be said about a person himself, not just his ancestors. But a person should not expect to get a pass if they behave improperly, even if they are tzaddikim, and they up until this point have done amazing things. But God forbid a person steps out of line, they can still get the full punishment, and perhaps even more so. Because when a person is a tzaddik, and has been behaving as a tzaddik, and people look up to him as a tzaddik, him or her, and they say, wow, this is what tzaddikim do, and this is what we should take an example from. And then if God forbid they do a misstep, something that people also can take an example from, that's not so bad, and maybe that's okay, and whatever. So that can influence people in a much more negative way than another person. So that is true. That's a good point. Anybody else? No? Okay. So here we go. So the Rebbe explains this by looking a little bit further into the parable. If we examine the parable more closely, we'll come to understand why Aaron had to be warned about this. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah gave an example from a sick person who was warned by the doctor, do not eat cold food and do not sleep in a cold place. And this is particularly important to a person who has a fever. A person who has a fever feels very hot, and they might be tempted to drink cold drinks in order to give themselves relief from the heat that they're feeling. In addition, they might be tempted to sleep in a cold place, once again, because they're feeling so hot from their fever, that they want to sleep in somewhere cold just to cool off. And that's where the doctor has to say to them, hey, I know that you have this temptation. I know it's not an easy temptation to overcome. And that's why I'm giving you a very severe warning. Look at what happened to so-and-so. They could not overcome their temptation, and they died. So even though it's tempting, you gotta overcome it. It's like, you get a mosquito bite, and it's tempting to itch it. It gives you temporary relief. But the more you itch it, the more itchy it gets. So you have to overcome your temptation, not try to give yourself a temporary relief, and you'll get a faster, more permanent relief if you can do that. A person, God forbid, could be stuck at sea with no water, and there's water all around them in the ocean, and they might be tempted to drink that salt water. But we have to inform them, no. Don't drink the salt water, because that will dehydrate you more, having that salt water in your system. And even though it seems very tempting, no, that's not the way to go. You have to be careful. So it's especially when there's a temptation and there's a reason why a person might not follow the doctor's advice, that the doctor finds it necessary, should find it necessary, to give examples. Bringing it back to Aaron and his sons. Aaron's sons died because they entered into the Holy of Holies. Why do you think they entered into the Holy of Holies?
They wanted to get closer to Hashem.
Thank you very much. That is exactly the words of the Parsha. After the death of the two sons of Aaron, the Korvasam Lifnei Hashem Vayemus, when they came close to Hashem and they died, meaning to say, they recognized that the Holy of Holies is the holiest place in the world. And they wanted to experience being in that holy place so that they could get as close to Hashem as they possibly could. If we think back to the story of the giving of the Torah that we read a few months ago in Parshas Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu had to have signs put up around the mountain saying, do not come close to the mountain, do not touch it, because he told the people they might die. And once again, the signs had to be put up. It wasn't enough to just warn them. And not only did he warn them earlier, but on the day of the giving of the Torah, Hashem told them, go back down and remind them not to come up on the mountain. Meaning to say that since on the top of the mountain was Hashem's presence, and there's the natural yearning that a person might have to come close and be in Hashem's presence, and that's why they had to be warned. No, it's not appropriate. Every person has to be in the right place. You can come up to the point that you can be, but not beyond that point. The people had their own place. The Zakanim, the sages, had a closer place. The sons of Aaron had a closer place. Aaron had a closer place, and Moshe Rabbeinu himself went up all the way to the top. But a person who would, God forbid, go beyond where it was appropriate for them, they would not be able to handle that holiness, and they could die. Which is exactly what happened to the sons of Aaron, that they went into the holiest place without the proper preparation, not being ready for it, and it was like a lightning bolt. A lightning bolt has great energy, but if you don't have the tools to accept it, God forbid, it can strike a person dead. If you can channel that energy into a generator, you know what I'm saying? You could power New York City for like 3 minutes, I think. But if not, then God forbid, it can be fatal. Yes, Susan, go ahead.
I don't mean to get off on the subject, but I wanted to ask, Moses did he have to wear a mask or cover his face when he went up to the top of the mountain? And also, did that inhibit his speech? I know he supposedly had a speech impediment, and I'm just curious about all this.
So the mask was not when he was on the mountain. The mask was on the contrary, when he came off the mountain. So because he was so close to Hashem, and Hashem, so to speak, had put his hand over the cleft of the rock where Moshe was, so his face was shining. It had like a halo. And people could not look directly at his face. It was too intense. The only time he could take off that mask is when he was teaching Torah. At that time, they were able to handle it, but not otherwise. And actually, seeing that you were asking also about the speech impediment, there's a similar thing that while he was teaching Torah, he did not have that impediment, and he only had it during the rest of the time.
So it was removed. When he was teaching Torah, it was clear as a bell.
Exactly.
And when he was doing other things like mundane work, he went back to his having issues.
Exactly.
Oh.
It reminds me of my
Thank
friend, my pleasure. It reminds me of my friend, Mr. Steinmetz. I don't know if I ever told you the story. Efri Steinmetz from Venezuela. I may have shared the story before, but I'll tell it quickly in case I did already. So he had a stroke, and it was basically impossible to understand him speaking. And I was davening in a minyan with him in the Sephardic shul of Bal Harbor, and he was called up for an aliyah by the gabbai who knew him from Venezuela, so he knew his name. He didn't even have to go over to him and ask his name. If he would have known that he can't really speak. But he called him to get an aliyah. And I'm standing there, and I'm very embarrassed for him. And he went up there and he belted out those brachas like beautiful, like a bar mitzvah boy. Okay. And I mentioned to his family afterwards what happened. and they told me that he can daven beautifully. He can't speak, but he can daven beautifully. It was like the words of the davening were so embedded in his soul that they were not affected by the stroke. So yeah, that's the way it was with Moshe Rabbeinu's Torah. He could speak perfectly, and he did not need the mask at that time. Other times he did. Okay, so coming back to the example for the sick person, the doctor tells the sick person, don't do this and that, even though it's tempting, but ultimately it's dangerous. You might get temporary relief, but ultimately it's dangerous. And he gives an example from so and so. So Aaron might have had a similar temptation to his sons, considering that Aaron was their father, and a father and a son is, often
You're frozen, Rabbi. You were frozen.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So so a father and a child is similar often in certain respects. And that's why the Hashem, so to speak, had to warn. I can't say had to, but that's why Hashem warned him, don't do this like your sons did. And because look what happened to them. Now, every word of the Tanakh is precise. In fact, every word of Rashi is precise. And Rashi gives two examples here. He says, the doctor says, don't eat cold foods. And he also says, don't sleep in damp places. And this relates to two mistakes that the sons of Aaron did, and that Aaron should not repeat. There are two mistakes here. One mistake is a person who might not follow the protocol of bringing the proper sacrifices before going in. You want to go into a holy place, you have to have a preparation. In fact, besides the sacrifices, Aaron had to be sequestered from his family and from the rest of the Jewish people for 7 days. He actually lived on the temple grounds in a special apartment for 7 days to make sure that he would not become ritually impure even by accident. And then, of course, he was reviewing the laws of Yom Kippur and what he would have to do. And then on the day itself, there's the major, things that have to take place. Like I said, the mikvah, special clothes, special sacrifices, and so on. So a person who would not do that can be compared to a person who is eating the wrong foods. Like a sacrifice is something that's internalized. And eating the wrong foods can have a very big impact on a person. It's something you bring into yourself. And that's why there's that desire on the one hand to eat it, even though you might know that it's not healthy intellectually, but you still have that desire because it's going to cool you off. So the comparison is to go into the Holy of Holies, even without the right sacrifices, but you feel like this is gonna cool me off. This is gonna make me close to Hashem, even though I didn't do these preparations. And the person is tempted, and we say, no, look at the sons of Aaron, see what happened, and don't follow that. The other mistake they made is that they did not wait until the right time. The right time of the year to go into the Holy of Holies is only on Yom Kippur. If a Kohen Gadol wants to do everything that the Parsha says on any other day of the year, he wants to wear white, he wants to take 2 goats, he wants to take the incense, he wants to take a bull, all those things. Sorry, it's the wrong time of the year. The Holy of Holies could only be entered on the holiest day by the holiest person. It's a convergence of the holiest time of the year, the holiest person in the world, and the holiest place in the world. Those three things have to converge. And if it's not that, then the results can be tragic. And that's an example of the doctor who says, don't sleep in a damp place. So sleeping in a damp place is more external than eating the wrong food, but nevertheless, it also has its impact. In the same way, a Kohen Gadol who says, I'm going to make all these preparations, but I'm just not going to wait till that day. So that seems like a little bit more external, like he is preparing himself internally in terms of all the other preparations. But nevertheless, it's not the right day of the year, and therefore the results can be tragic. So far, so good. Questions? No questions?
We have learned in the previous lessons that Aaron's sons actually had a history of misbehaving. Boys who were really believed that they know best and they don't have to follow rules. And could it be part of it that they really needed to learn that some things cannot go unpunished, that this is so important. It matters so much that just to, slap on the wrist is not something that could work. This is one question. And second question, maybe it was kind of an idea that because they were his sons, Aaron's sons, he kind of thought that maybe it would make him feel more kind of relief.
You're breaking up a little bit. Just repeat the last question, I'm sorry.
Really okay. The second reason I believe that it could be
Anna, you're breaking up.
I'm not hearing you properly. Maybe type up the second question because I'm not able to hear it.
Yeah. Anna, you're breaking up on us, so we can't hear you.
I have a question. If his sons were already bound,
Hold on.
One second, Susan. One second. Let me answer Anna's first question. Let me answer her first question, and then if you want to type up your second question, okay.
Oh,
So,
okay. I assume that Hashem was.
Many nights, and that's when I need the money. You understand? I don't need it now. I don't need it.
Moshe, we can hear you.
Yeah, please take him offline.
all right, I'm muting everybody. Too much background information and stuff. So Anna, please type up your second question if you like, because I couldn't hear it. The answer to your first question, in terms of the sons of Aaron having a issue with authority, there is something to be said about that. The Gemara says that they were walking behind Moshe and Aaron, and they said, when will these old people die already, and we can and we can take over. So there definitely was some aspect of ego and so on. But on the other hand, we do have to take into account that these were great men, sons of great men, who were, they were kind of expected to take over because Moshe's sons were not on the level, and therefore they did have very many positive qualities. So even though that point of ego is a point, and there's no question that that played into their sin, because in fact, if they would not have been, had that attitude of knowing it all, they would have consulted with Moshe and Aaron before going into the Holy of Holies, despite having good intentions, and not having done so was definitely part of what led to that tragedy. But on the other hand, they did have that desire to go into the Holy of Holies and be close to Hashem. So they're both true. And we have to take a lesson from both aspects. Okay, let me go to your question. Trying to find it. I'm on my phone instead of my computer because
Her question is that, or she said that feeling of guilt for not raising them correctly. In other words, Aaron, feelings of guilt for not raising them correctly. That's what she put in the message.
right. Well, what can we say? We all do our best with our children, and they don't necessarily end up the way we expected them to. And there certainly could be feelings of guilt there, but that's just a reality we have to live with. We can't control our children. We sometimes think we can, but ultimately they become adults and choose their own paths and their own ways, and we can try to influence them, but we can't control them. And in terms of feeling guilty, yeah, that's just a natural thing that could happen. I don't know what can be done about that. Susan, you had a
I'm
question?
curious if they perished in fire, and what happened after? What happened to? Was there anything? Was there a funeral or no funeral for the
So
boys?
they actually, their bodies remained intact because the fire entered through their nostrils and they were only burned internally. Their bodies on the outside remained intact, and they were taken outside by their cousins, Mishael and Eltsafan, and they were given a burial, they were given a funeral, everything like that, and they were mourned, but they were only mourned by the rest of the Jewish people. Aaron, the father, and Elazar, some of the brothers, could not take off time to mourn them because they were busy at the consecration of the Mishkan, and Hashem wanted them to not stop the festivities, even though they had suffered that tragedy.
Okay.
And as we read in the verse, Aaron was silent and he accepted that. So that was a very high level that he was able to accept Hashem's judgment and continue his service. Okay, so now I'm going to go out on a limb and start to say a pshat explanation, even though I don't know how it ends. I remember how it starts, and I don't remember how it ends. I'm hoping that as I'm saying it, Hashem will put the ending into my mind. All right? You ready?
Yes, very interesting. Go ahead, Rabbi.
Okay, so the Rebbe says, when Rashi quotes a teaching, he doesn't usually tell us who said it. Sometimes he does. He'll say, well, this is from the translation of Onkelos, or this is from the Medrash, or this is from the Talmud. But often he doesn't tell us that. And even if he does tell us it's the Medrash or the Talmud, he doesn't necessarily say which rabbi in the Talmud or which rabbi in the Medrash said it. And here Rashi says, Omer Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said. So, obviously, there must be something to learn from the fact that he quotes that particular rabbi. What can be learned from that? So if we think about Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, it calls to mind what he is quoted as saying in the Haggadah. In the Haggadah, which we read not so long ago, we read that Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah said, I am like 70 years old, and yet I could not figure out how to prove that you're supposed to recall the Exodus at night. And the commentaries discuss, what did he mean that he was like 70 years old? Was he 70? Was he 69? What's like 70? And they quote the story in the Talmud that says that the Sanhedrin had no leader. They had deposed Rabbi Gamliel because of a political fight. And they set their eyes on Elazar ben Azariah. He had good yichus. He was from Ezra the Kohen. He was wealthy. He was smart. He hadn't got into any other fights, maybe because he was young, but that's the fact. And they wanted to put him as the head. He said, I have to discuss it with my wife. And his wife said, you don't have any white hair. Meaning to say, you don't have the experience necessary to lead such an esteemed body of sages. So that night, miraculously, his beard turned white, or at least he got 18 strands of white in his beard. And the next day, he accepted the position. Now, the question is, what does white hair in the beard help? The point that his wife was making was not just that he doesn't look old, but that he's actually not old. Meaning to say, you can be very bright, you can be very smart, you can have read tons of stuff, but there's a certain wisdom that comes from age and from experience and from living through things that gives you a certain perspective that a young person doesn't have. And that's what his wife was saying. So what's the difference if he has white in his beard? I mean, he could just dye it white and finished. He doesn't even need a miracle for that. Obviously, it's not about that. Rather, the explanation is that Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah had the wisdom in him because he came from such great stock. He came from such great people. He was able, in his short life, to gain that knowledge, not just the book knowledge, but the life knowledge. He was able to pick it up so quickly because of the stock that he came from. It recalls a story of the Tzemach Tzedek's youngest son, whose birthday was celebrated on Sunday, the Rebbe Maharash, and a conversation that he had with one of his older brothers. The Rebbe Maharash was the youngest of 7 children, and his oldest brother had children who were older than him. And there was once a discussion in Torah, and he said the best answer, better than his oldest brothers, who, like I said, were an entire generation older than him. And one of them said to him, how did you come up with such an interpretation? And he said to them, you're older with your own years. I'm older with my father's years. Meaning to say, I was born when my father was older and wiser, and he gave to me that wisdom, and I was just born with it. I was born with greater wisdom because my father was greater at the time. So similarly, Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, so to speak, had ingrained wisdom because of his ancestors. And the point, and now I'm remembering how this relates back to the Rashi, Hashem helped, Baruch Hashem. And the idea is that the fact that Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah had that ingrained in him from his parents is to prove the importance of the chain of parents to children. And that is to help us understand how, just like Nadav and Avihu had the tendency to enter into the Holy of Holies, that was their natural yearning, so too Aaron had that same tendency because the parents and the children are so connected, and therefore it's likely that if the children
You're still frozen.
You lost your voice.
I'm here, I'm back. Susan, you had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about inheriting intuition, inheriting the ability to see things, number one, that you're not really supposed to see because you're young, you don't have that experience, but you inherit certain intuition or intuitive powers from your parents. If your parents are very young, if your parents are 20 years old when they have you, they haven't really had many life experiences. But if they're older parents, you inherit not just the physicality, but you inherit something that's beyond mental.
There's something to that. I don't know specifically about intuition, but there is something to that, which is what the Rebbe is saying here, that the parents, the life experience that they have and the wisdom they have is also imparted to their children, so that their children that they have later in life might actually be born with greater levels of intellect and wisdom, simply because their parents had that much more at that time. Because when we change ourselves, we can actually change our DNA to a certain degree, and that can be passed on.
But that's been proven in DNA. That's been proven.
Exactly.
It's a chemical reaction that comes about in your brain. So it's not a mumbo jumbo. It's not black magic. It's a physicality that right.
You can actually change that. That is something the scientists say now. Okay, I thank you very much for joining. I apologize again for coming late. Next week, I will not be here on Tuesday, but God willing, I'll be here on Thursday instead.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Nice
Rabbi.
to see you all. Stay safe.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Rabbi.
All the best. Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you,
night.
Rebbe.
My pleasure.